there's a lot of issues, but they boil down to some central things, which you've been talking about tonight. Basically getting financial regulation right, but actually doing your stimulus packages right in a way that both deals with the poorest in any country and the poorest of the world, but also does it in a green way that actually puts in a whole investment for the future to make a really different world.
Doesn't it also boil down to the fact that laissez-faire economics has failed here? Yeah. That actually the experiment with the market, which Labour have inherited from Margaret Thatcher, that we financialise our lives, that mortgages, that pensions, that loans, that PFI, that students, everything is tied up within the financial system and it's privatised. So the state pushes the onus onto us to financialise our lives and to speculate, and yet withdraws from those areas of common concern, which should be about providing proper pensions and council housing, to stop inflationary bubbles like this, to give people sort of proper, decent housing, to actually fund colleges, to make sure that we've ended up with a ridiculous system where the Home Office building is actually owned offshore. Most of the government buildings are owned offshore by PFI. This is ridiculous. We're paying rent to tax dodgers. The system itself has failed.
I would accept, Mark, your point that what we've seen is not just the collapse of individual institutions, but the collapse of an ideology that says everything the market does is right and everything that government does is wrong. The chance that we have tomorrow, we're not going to complete the work in the next 24 hours, is to find a better balance. And I think there was an imbalance which has developed over the last 20 to 30 years. Government has actually been where people have turned in this crisis. That's why you can't deregulate or nudge your way out of this crisis. You need coordinated government action, which is exactly what this Labour government's trying to do.
OK, let's engage with this climate change point. You're concerned that if it is touched upon, it will be touched upon in a rather pathetic kind of way, which sanctions all kinds of things like carbon.
They're scarcely mentioning it at all. It's going to be, we're considering, exploring, thinking about possibly maybe saying something one day perhaps, but maybe we'll ignore it. This should be absolutely at the heart of what we're doing. This is the most pressing issue facing humanity, no argument. Arguably the most pressing issue that's ever faced humanity since we stood up and walked out the savannah. And you're behaving like it's some kind of side issue, like it's something we should do something about, but, tweak it a little bit maybe, like homelessness. It's serious, but, it's not the central thing of society. It's because you know that with the economic problems, that people are going to be angry with you and they're going to be voting for you in a couple of years on this stuff. Whereas with climate change, by the time that comes home through is 20, 30 years' time, you're not looking for re-election then. Now, if you were looking for re-election in 30 years' time, or if you were going to be alive for a couple of centuries, you would be seeing this as the central problem of the age. But instead, you're just passing it forward to future generations.
Well, it's exactly because I've got children that I'm concerned about climate change, but I'll be honest with you, we won't get a global climate deal tomorrow. The right place to get that agreement is in Copenhagen in December. But let's be honest, the way that we can give the best likelihood to that outcome is to prove that when the world comes together, it can agree a common programme. If we fail tomorrow, I honestly believe the likelihood of the world coming together around a comprehensive climate deal in October in Copenhagen will go down, not up. So our challenge is to work between now and Copenhagen to get that agreement. Today I met with Chancellor Merkel, I met with President Sarkozy, I met with a whole range of world leaders specifically on this issue of climate change. It is vitally important. But we need to recognise that this is not the negotiations that are taking place tomorrow. It's a UN process that will reach that deal.
So what you're saying is that by ignoring it, we're going to make it look as if we're taking it more seriously. It's like rather than saying this should be at the centre, rather than saying that this is essentially an industrial problem, and so when we're talking about rejuvenating industries, that's what we should be focusing on. We'll just pretend it's not part of industry until then.
I'm not saying we should ignore it. I'm saying that if you want a genuinely equitable climate deal, you need to have all the countries who are affected by that deal represented. And it's actually an equity argument to say we need every country as part of the climate deal represented. The right forum is the United Nations process, and it's important that we see this as a stepping stone, one important stepping stone on the road to a deal in Copenhagen.
It's not those who are affected who need to be represented, it's those who are causing the problem, and pretty much by definition, those with the larger economies are the higher emitters, and it's that who you're seeing at the Excel Centre. It is their responsibility.
And the Americans tried a major emitter process, and we said we thought there was a better way to do it, which was through the United Nations. I still hold to the multilateralist approach to the United Nations.
I just want to ask briefly, you guys, there is a lot of anger out there. There are a lot of things that people are concerned about. Do you get any sense that governments are changing the way that they think?
I think that governments are changing the way they present the vision of how they portray themselves as thinking. So their PR is certainly changing. But I'm not sure that we hear anything of any substance of how they're really changing.
No, and basically people are so frightened, governments are so frightened at the moment about what they are going to have to do to just solve today's problems for their own people, that there just doesn't seem to be enough time for governments even to be thinking, how will this system really work well for the good of us all across the world for the future?
And there's nothing questioning consumer capitalism, and there's certainly nothing that says that whether economic growth should be the point of society.
But at a human level, don't you have
insane.
a degree of sympathy for organisations confronted with one hell of a big problem, seeking to settle it by mechanisms that they understand and have seen have worked, albeit with undesirable consequences as far as many of you guys are concerned?
No, I'm sorry, I've got no sympathy for people who got themselves into it. You know, if somebody's like, if I go to somebody and say, oh, it's real, I'm really sorry, but you're a fireman and you were pointing the hose the wrong way and the building burned down and everybody died, I've got very little sympathy for him.
But what we need is this group of G20 leaders and, in fact, the rest of the world's governments to really face up to these problems as new global problems together. And that includes the climate change. There's got to be a whole way of going about these problems that are much bigger and all together.
There's an old Einstein quote which is, don't try and solve a problem using the thinking that created it. And that's what's happening still.
All right. Thank you all very much indeed. Thanks.